being streamed online.
Over the time.
So if I can have the focus up here while we're talking, because it's being streamed live, and I'm going to go ahead and start. So I'm talking about visual thinking, and I am covering strategies. So by that, I'll start with some things like research strategies, because how search engines see images is very different than the way that we see them. It's fundamentally, obviously, not a text-based medium, whether you're talking about something like a chart or you're talking about something like a photo. Search strategies matter. Assets, I'll get into things like IP issues, copyright, public domain, Creative Commons. How do you work with that? Because that's a much more significant issue for visuals than it is for text, because it's much harder to excerpt when you're talking about fair use for an image the way that you can for somebody's article. You can't quote it. You're taking the whole work. So you have to take that into account. And tools, I'll show some free graphic design tools that I think are very accessible for any basic beginner, whether or not you have any background. So what is my background? My name is Emily Barney. My Twitter handle is eBarney. If you've been on the CALIcon hashtag, you've probably seen me on there. My title just changed. I am now the Technology, Training, and Marketing Librarian. Many of you have probably sat in, I've seen some of you at my sessions at Cali before talking about WordPress. That's still a big part of my job. Obviously, when you're talking about WordPress, you're talking about websites. It might be a blog, it might be something else, but there is likely to be the need for visuals, so that's part of why I'm talking about this in relation to that. I also provide event photography for my school, and I'm on the social media marketing team with our marketing department. With faculty, I support image research when they're working on things, whether it's for a presentation or an article that they're publishing, or they're just curious about how to find something. This presentation was requested by Will, so I'm giving it, hooray. But it's also one that I was able to recycle slightly because I had a faculty in our legal persuasion class ask me to come in and give this presentation. So I've updated it, expanded certain sections, slightly different. So Will has those old slides. You should see some new content anyway. I also help faculty and staff individually with presentation design and review. That's obviously not something I have time to do for all of our students individually, but because they do know that I'm kind of a tech training person, I do have people who come into my office with their laptop. How do I make this PowerPoint thing work? So I do that as well. Besides all of that, I also have a background in art education and photography. I have a Flickr page, and you'll hear me talking about Flickr ad nauseum. I use WordPress for myself for a recipe blog, and I do some of the same skills that I do at work in volunteering. So I help run WordCamp Chicago, where I do social media and event photography and websites, and I've been teaching photography and photo editing volunteer level, so getting my art education in as many places as I can. So enough about me. What about you? What do you already know? I am making the very brave assumption that those of you who are here because there's at least something on there that you might need a visual for. Whether it's a presentation like this one, something that will be published, maybe you're sending something to a magazine or something like that. By published, I do mean in print. Websites, of course, covers everything else. Emails, you might have things that you're trying to send out in terms of branded stuff. Those are a little bit more challenging than websites. If you've ever tried to do a fancy looking email with HTML stuff, you know what I mean. A lot of people use services, and you have more restrictions on the size and other technical limitations when it comes to things like that. Social media, there are also technical limitations when it comes to that. One of the issues that we run into is sometimes we always post for our trial advocacy programs whenever students go out, and we'll get pictures back because obviously we're not going on the road with them to take photos, and there's something they took on their phone and we want to share it, and if you share that low resolution photo that you just got from somebody's cell phone on Twitter, it decides to crop it to this. Yep. And you're like, inappropriate. So you have to recrop things because you have to know how, when you share it, it looks one way, but when it goes up online, it might look some other way. So making sure that whatever you're putting out there is professional is important. And I mean, most of us live in the real world with people. We're not all, totally online institutions, so we also need to put signs up sometimes. So there's a wide variety, and let's keep in mind that a lot of these, one place turns into another. So I was mentioning at the last session that I attended that Chicago Kent has a blog called CK Now that is covering legal issues in the transition after the presidential election. So one of the things that I try to pay attention to is when we're putting illustrations together for the website, if I put them into the WordPress site and people subscribe via email, will it show up the same way as it does on the website? No, I found out. I had little nice thumbnails that were like 150 by 150 in a little row. And then I got the email, and they were full-size pictures pushing down all the content. And I was like, I didn't know it did that. So I just keep that in mind and put the read more or bold above that now. Or don't use that type of thing. So that went out via email without my control because it's another service we're using. We usually also try to share blog posts that we put out on our social media channels for the school and make sure that they're optimized so if other people share them, they look right. So then I have to think about in WordPress, that means do I have a featured image or have I gone into the settings and said this one will show up nicely on Facebook, on Twitter, on whatever else. So as I'm doing that, I'm trying to think ahead, like how can I make this effective in every single place that people are going to see it? So not everybody has to do all the things I have to do. You might just do one of them, and that's fine. But pay attention to your goals. So when I think about this and I think about the previous list of possible ways that you could be using images, drawing attention is when you have kind of information overload and you really want people to focus. So we have definitely seen in the stats for the school social media that if we share a link that doesn't have an image, people blaze right past it because they're on Facebook or they're on Twitter or something like that, and they're just getting a constant onslaught of stories. And it's not something they're as likely to click on if it doesn't catch their attention. So something that has a picture conveys so much information really quickly that you don't have to read the full title and the tweet to see, oh, maybe this is something I'm interested in. Maybe I saw the face of somebody that I knew. Maybe that's my favorite professor. Maybe it's just something that looks interesting because of the way that it's conveyed. Summarizing information is much more likely to be something that happens in a presentation like this. It could be happening in an article online. It could be happening in print. But it's important to pay attention to how close people are to it, because if you're trying to summarize too much information and people can't read it, you've lost your audience. And dramatizing a story, I think, could really apply to any setting, but it really depends on what you're doing. So for that, it might be something like a picture of their favorite professor implies, oh, I already know this professor's an expert in that. That's not the most engaging, perhaps, story that I can think of, but that's what comes to mind right away. A lot of times we don't necessarily have dramatic stories to tell, but we can think about how people connect with faces as opposed to a whole room, for example. So who is your audience? This is one of those issues where working at a law school, we have had some mixed success. Debbie here did a presentation for our legal faculty on different presentation tools they could use. And she was trying to show one of the options that I'll talk about later, which is flowcharts, and saying, hey, instead of putting up a giant block of bullet point text, you could break it into sections that show how they're related to each other. And she showed it to the faculty and she said, here's the before, here's the after, isn't it great? And they said, no, I don't understand that. I don't like it. Make it go away. So that's not to say anything against them. They're experts at evaluating lots of blocks of information very well. So they have trained their brains to focus on in-depth information. That's a skill. It's not a bad thing. But the problem is our students don't have that skill. And so that's what we were trying to persuade them is, hey, like this is easy for you. It's not easy for everybody. So please keep your audience in mind. So when we're talking to faculty, we do make sure we have more detailed information because they want to validate that this is really what they're looking for by reading. Much more than a logo like this. A lot of times I'll use visual metaphors and I'll have people come up afterwards and be like, what was that? What did that mean? So I have to think, if I'm making something that for me as a very visual person, as a photographer, as somebody who's interested in these things, I'm like, oh, that's a symbol for this. Somebody else may not remember that. So I need to be more empathetic in my responses and choices. What do they already know? This is important when you're getting into things like charts. And what will they connect with? So like I said, pictures of our professors, pictures of classmates, pictures of faces a lot of times do more because people are like, oh, that I recognize that. Designing for accessibility. And by this, I'm definitely keeping in mind things like disabilities, but it applies to everybody. Legibility and size I already mentioned, and I'll show examples of that later. Color contrast, there are tools out there that help you evaluate whether something's going to be readable. I use, for pretty much every presentation I do, this black background, white text, and a few other colors, because if I don't know what kind of room I'm walking into, how bright it's going to be, I think this has the best chance of being legible on a screen, regardless of how much light there is in the room. if I was using something that had a blue background and like purple text or something like that, it might not be legible on this screen. Color contrast is obviously also important for people who have color blindness, which is a larger segment of the room, and it's one of those kind of invisible issues. So there are tools out there. This is pronounced totally, but it's got two ones. That adds a small pop-up that you can evaluate any website. So it's just a little, you drag a link up onto your bookmarks toolbar and you click on it and you can then evaluate a lot of things like alt text. So especially when you're talking about visuals, if you don't provide that information, it's not only going to not help somebody who has a screen reader, which is admittedly a fairly small portion of people, but it also makes it more difficult for Google to know what that image is. Because the more direct metadata that you're providing about the images on your websites or things like that, wherever alt text would apply, the more effective it's going to be for search engine results. So that's worth keeping in mind, that you can boost your content just by following accessibility guidelines. I like win-wins. So this is what I'll kind of structure my presentation around. I found this on a website called extremepresentation.com, visualization taxonomies. Obviously, as a librarian, I love taxonomies. But these are simple kind of journalism type questions. Any kind of story you're telling should have something like this in it. If you can identify which thing it has the most of, whatever you're trying to communicate, then you can decide which one is best. So don't go down a rabbit hole of trying to find a portrait of somebody when it makes more sense to have a chart to evaluate their data. A timeline is great for specific other things, so I'll go through all of this now. But before I get into research strategies, where do you want to start? I highly recommend not wasting a lot of time because these are the sorts of things that are easy to go down a rabbit hole with. The other thing is keep in mind whether what you're doing is something that you're going to need to get feedback. Collaboration could be, hey, am I going down the right track because I'm doing this for somebody else? It could be, maybe somebody else needs to edit it because you have a co-author or a co-presenter and you want to make sure that they can look at it while you're doing it. It might even be something like direct access. Somebody else needs to upload pieces of things. So tools that have collaboration built in will save you a lot of time rather than sending files back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Choosing key features, that depends on your product or project, what the requirements are, but if you can kind of map that out in your head of, oh, it's really going to matter that this is something that fits a specific size format because I'm going to be sharing it in this sort of thing. Or I need to make sure this has branding and it actually matches the graphic design of our institutional requirements. How do I find those things? Will this allow me to customize it? Those are helpful too. And backup options, because if this is a project you're going to come back to and maybe want to use one as a template and keep going, you're going to want it to be an editable tool, not something that just outputs whatever. So these are a few small, and you guys don't need to take pictures of everything. You can see there's links in here. I'll send this out after I'm done with my talk with the link so you can actually look at this. Oh, interesting. My emoji changed this computer. That's because I actually used an emoji keyboard that's using the, what are those, UTC codes? So they look different depending on the platform that you're on. Interesting. So these are all things that you can put into Chrome, and I use them, and I'll give an example of how I use them in a second. These are the graphic design tools that I would recommend. I'm just going to limit it to two because these are the ones I keep going back to. Canva and Google Slides. And so here's a case study. Our Journal of Intellectual Property runs on WordPress. It uses featured images, as I already mentioned, and occasionally they do something where it doesn't actually have a featured image, but we want to share it on Facebook, and we know this is a sort of really abstract topic that people are not going to be drawn to by itself. If we can do something that makes it more attractive, it's more likely they'll look at it. So here's an example of one that they did, and I looked at it and I said, oh, that's great, good job. But Creative Commons, the joining of creativity and protection, did not have one. So what I did was I used the inspect tool to right-click on the text here to figure out which font they were using. And then I found an image for free, and then I put it together. So let me show you how that worked. Escape this. So here's the blog live. Here are some other examples of their blog posts. So if I had one like this one up at the top that had no image, what I would do, I'm in Chrome, so I click on Inspect, and that pulls up a whole lot of information. And if you're not somebody who reads HTML regularly, don't worry about it. it does help to narrow it down. You can just kind of scan over it until you see what controls what you're looking at. So once you click on something like this, and I don't actually like using this as a sidebar, I like using it down here personally. When I click on computed, it shows me all the specific things. So I don't have to automatically know which font that is. I can find it by looking through what code is controlling the design of this website. This is just something that's built into Chrome. It's something that's built into Firefox. It's not something you have to install. It's not something that if you make any changes here will do anything. It's a way to preview code changes if you want to fiddle with that, but it doesn't actually do anything to the website. It's just a way of looking at it. Because honestly, every website is editable this way. You'd have to work really hard to get rid of that. So I found out, as I mentioned, that this is the Oswald font family. And then I created this, which I just imported. So when I'm in Google Drive, which I'm in right now for this presentation, there are a ton of fonts. I can also click on more fonts, and I can search for them. So I've already installed this one. Yeah, I've already installed this one too. There's a lot of them I use regularly, but there are other ones out there. So if it's something that is available, then I can type the words in and make all the changes that I need to. I found this image on Flickr, and it looked completely different, but it had the background that I wanted, something that was fairly abstract. Now, this is not something that would work well in terms of text contrast. If I was putting black text on top of this gray background, it would be hard to read. So when I copied and pasted the image and brought it over to Google Drive, it is here, and it has image options. And all I had to do was choose from a range of colors that it offered to one that I thought would be the best option, and then make a couple little slider changes. So all of this is pretty nice graphic design stuff that I could do in just a couple minutes. So I found the image by searching for Creative Commons. This is not surprising to me that this photo is by someone named Quinn Dombrowski, because I actually went to library school with her, and she's amazing on Flickr. So if you just want to use Flickr regularly, I highly recommend friend Quinn Dombrowski, because it'll show all of her pictures before everybody else's. And she used to take photos every single day and put them up with excellent metadata. So thanks, Quinn. Actually, this is what I was showing in the previous slide, was I shared it with her back to say, hey, I thought you'd enjoy this. So this is what it looks like when I put it into the thing for sharing on social media. It pops up really nicely. But this slide then, to get it out, when I go up to File, Download As includes not just things like PowerPoint or PDF or text, but also several different vector and graphic files. So if you need a picture with text that is a rectangular format, why not play with this? The nice thing is I actually have a slide deck set up for this journal in case they forget to do something like that, and I can just add another slide, and it's already got the fonts and everything else created. So if you're doing something like this that's for sharing on social media or on a blog, a lot of times they use this 2x1 kind of format, and this will work great. You don't have to learn how to do graphic design. You already know how to create PowerPoints, so just use Google Drive. Also, Google Drive is completely shareable. So if I click on Share for this presentation right now, it is currently shared with Debbie Ginsburg and limited to people. But now I can say anyone with the link can view it, and I'll have that link ready to go when I am finished with the presentation. I could change it to any person with any level of access that I wanted. Can view, can comment, can edit. Obviously, I'm just giving view access for the general web. Now, what if you need to do something that is not this sort of text and rectangle? Canva is really nice because it provides templates for pretty much anything that I mentioned in that early list. So it has things like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, but it also has things like blog graphics and posters and presentations. It has a lot of graphics built in. It has apps that work on iOS. I did not find one for Android users, but it works great on the web. You can collaborate with under 10 people for free. It does have some images that you have to pay for, but they're usually about $1. And if you don't want to go through the next step, which is image research, their stuff is pretty great, and that's pretty cheap. So if you just need to get something out there really quickly, it's great. It has a lot of the same free fonts built in, but it also gives you templates and design recommendations that you can just browse through. And the fact that they're automatically sized for the things that they want means that you don't ever have to worry about, I have this beautiful square image, but then I tried to put it on Twitter and it told me it was too high of resolution. So you don't have to worry about it because it already takes care of that. You can also, if you're like me and really want the exact image you want, you can download pictures from somewhere else and upload them to Canva and use it that way. So there's just for sharing the slides, it's not, again, because I expect you all to read my slides. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing design is image text legibility is really important. So in these two examples of something that we did for Facebook, this one works a little bit better than this one. Both of them have the old logo, but that's not a big deal. So font choice matters a lot for how clear it is. Color contrast is really, really important. If you don't get the font choice or the color choice, ways that you can increase legibility include like this where you put a block in and you adjust the transparency. Shadows, the image at the top sort of looks like it has a shadow. That's fake. That's a technique I use all the time. Let me show you how that works. Some of these free tools don't have all of these options that I would like that you can find when you're using something like Microsoft. If you've ever used WordArt and it has like all these different ways to make text pop, you won't find that in here. So what I have is a duplicate copy that is red, and then I just moved this around until it was showing up where I wanted to. I could decide that it is in the other direction by changing the order and sending that to the back, and then there you go. Now you have red text with white shadow, which I do not think is as legible, so I'm going to undo all of that. But as you can see, that didn't actually take a ton of work there. Whoops. I'm doing some of my styling because I went too far. Where was my last edit? I'm sorry, guys. Here we go. Okay, the other thing to keep in mind, and I mentioned this briefly, is if you are working at an academic institution or otherwise, it is likely that there is an institutional style guide. It is important to know whether they are going to jump all over you because you created your own logo and be like, you are not doing this, this is out of bounds, what are you doing, go away. If you can find an institutional style guide, however, a lot of times you can find really nice assets, the exact fonts that you need to do in order to make it look like the rest of the school's branding. They may provide those even though they're not free if you're an employee. Things like institutional photos. Speaking as somebody who does event photography, I would prefer that people actually use those pictures. So figure out who takes the pictures and whether they'll share them with you or whether they're already shared somewhere. Official portraits. Faculty will probably care about that. If you just Google a picture of somebody and you're not finding the one that they use for their profile, that might be something that really bugs them. So, screen capture I've used a lot here. I'm not going to go a lot into this, but I did want to mention it because sometimes people have questions. My default is Snagit. We do pay for it. It's not terribly expensive, but it has so many lovely features. It's definitely worth it. What?
No, it's worth it.
It's worth
Sorry.
it, yes.
Don't pay a lot for it.
There are things built in, which I do use on my personal computer because I am that cheap. I'll do Snagit when I get to work. All right, so image research. Let's get going. One thing that I recommend is making sure wherever you're searching for it, you are using whatever features they have available, definitely by license. Don't just search on the general web and think, I can find it, therefore I can use it. You're going to have a hard time arguing that that's fair use in most cases. Because like I said, you are using the entire image. Even if you're not for profit and things like that, it's better to find ones that let you limit the license and see if you can find something that you know you have permission to use before you go to something else. That's more challenging if you do need something like an official portrait of someone who is, currently active and they don't have stuff out there. But it's never that hard to find if you do have stuff. Figuring out the source of the image is one of the things that's really difficult with Google Images. And by color is just nice if you're doing something that you want to keep on a theme. Download options by size matters a lot more because, like I mentioned, if you have something that's huge, you probably want to think about what your use is and not waste space or have something that you can't upload again. And by file type, JPEG is default, it's highly compressed. PNG is what allows for something like this, where I actually have a slight gradient in the background of this slide. You can't tell in this light, but I wanted something that had a transparent background so it wouldn't look like a block of old-style clip art on top of it. So that's a PNG. It allows for transparency, which blends really nicely, and you don't have to worry about edges. SVG is something that comes up much more rarely, but that's a scalable vector graphic. So things like fonts are scalable because you can keep increasing the size or reducing them and it doesn't matter. So who? I already mentioned that faculty will probably prefer that you use their official portrait. The other thing to keep in mind is you've seen plenty of times that tabloids and other sources use unflattering portraits on purpose. There are ethical guidelines for this if you have any concerns about how people are choosing pictures. As an event photographer, I try really hard to get pictures of people, I tell them, at least looking pleasant. And most of them are like, I'll take that. Because the fact is, when you're taking pictures of somebody talking, it's really amazing how many expressions you don't realize. So people can look really unflattering really quickly. How they're dressed matters too, because you could get a picture of somebody at home and what they're trying to do is more professional, so they would prefer that you use their official portrait for that reason. What is the thing that gets a lot more difficult to find? So here are my visual strategies. Start with thinking about concrete objects instead of concepts. So instead of searching for finance or financial, if you search for dollar sign or money or any of those synonyms, you're much more likely to find a range of pictures. Especially if you're thinking about something that's a legal term. Most people don't talk the way lawyers talk. Shock. Metaphors. I was talking to Will about this earlier, but a lot of times we're already using visual language without realizing it when we're talking. So if you pay attention to the words that you're using, especially if you're describing it informally to someone, a lot of times there are words that you're using that have a visual metaphor or a concrete term that's associated with it. Association, sometimes I like to use contrast. If I can't find something specific, I'll use the opposite and then be able to work that into what I'm talking about. Provides a little bit of surprise. Historical images, if I'm talking about generalized things like, I gave a presentation where I was talking about things like images, videos, and text. And so I used a typewriter, really old photo, and a really old film reel-to-reel projector. And at that point, I don't have to use something that's specifically new technology. People get it. It represents something else. So if you can think of something like that, again, you have to think about your audience, whether they'll even recognize what the object is. If you go old enough, that helps. It's also really easy to find old pictures in the public domain, where it may be hard to find something that's recent. So here's an example of two things. So a topic was gold, and I just went with one visual metaphor of targets and archery, but I might have tried multiple terms. A lot of times you're much more likely to find what you need by redoing the search. And another one, and these are all, I'll show you really, really quickly, from our presentation last year. We were talking about process and challenges, obviously an extremely abstract topic, but then here's how we did it. So we talked about goals, and then our subtopic, we were kind of progressing through it, identifying our targets, effective strategies, and including the students. So all of these obviously are grouped together really clearly. I used minimal text with a semi-transparent background because obviously with that picture there was no area on it that was ever going to be a spot where the text, no matter what color I chose, would show up. I'm using Creative Commons images, so I made sure to put citations on every slide. So that's part of it. Here's the more abstract, talking about our process. So we started off with challenges, and then we talked about building partnerships, timing and attention. This should have text on it that says metacognitive miscalibration, and it's misbrought. I think that's probably a good metaphor. Confusing options. We're actually talking about Microsoft Word, so let me tell you how excited I was to find one with a giant W on a pothole. And I was talking about how it keeps changing all the time. I couldn't believe how lucky that was. But sometimes, and I was talking about this again with Will earlier, I will start down a path and find that the images suggest topics that I should talk about. So sometimes doing the image research early on in my presentation design really helps because I can think of something that's going to be a more effective way to communicate, and I can keep finding related topics. Transferring skills, we wanted to show how it's important to get people to look and how there's different languages, and again, I was really happy with that one. This is a much more obvious one. We're talking about modules. Modules, again, is a super abstract term, but this is not abstract. Everybody's used Legos or knows what Legos are. Most of us have probably stepped on them too. So this was easy because a lot of people surprisingly do take pictures of Legos. And we were talking about the process growing and how we were adding levels, so I was very happy with those being simple ones. But then I could change direction and say, hey, and then you could go totally out of the box. So again, here's some of the tools that I would recommend, and I will make these slides available to you. Wikimedia Commons, Flickr Advanced Search, Google Advanced Search to some extent, and there's a lot of cultural institutions now that are making images available as well. So here are examples of Flickr, which is my fave. Here is where you can change the license. So these are things that are really hard to find on any other search tool. And it's fairly well hidden, but I want you to know that they exist. No copyright restrictions includes both cultural institutions like the Library of Congress or the Internet Archive or things all over the world. It's always changing. There's new institutions all the time putting their image archives up on Flickr. It also is something that people can choose as an option to put their own pictures up as public domain, where they just release copyright from it. And there are some cultural institutions and current organizations that are doing that because they want their stuff to get out there. There's some people, honestly, I don't really understand it because I put my stuff up with Creative Commons because I would like at least to know that they're using it and that they're saying that I did it because I put work into taking pictures. I don't think that's a big ask, but some people don't care. And government work. So there are a ton of government agencies that have their stuff on here. And that's one of my favorite things is because obviously we're in legal education. We have things like an institute on the Supreme Court. And when they're putting stuff out, it's pretty abstract. But I can find beautiful pictures of the Supreme Court that are available for nothing as long as I'm not claiming that the government is sponsoring some sort of for-profit enterprise. And they're by the U.S. architect of the national Capitol. So of course they're going to be great. They're showing off their work. Here's ways that you can start to filter it. So when you've got results, it's got all those color things up there. It's also got things like, do you want shallow depth of field, or do you want it to be grayscale? And you can change the way that you view it. So this lets me see things like, is this a copyright image, or is this a public, Creative Commons? I evidently have all of the accounts on Flickr because these are the ones for the library, that's the one for the school, and that's my personal one. I didn't even realize that until I was looking at it. So here's a few of the features that I really like in Flickr. You can mark favorites. You can add tags, so if it doesn't have the term that you want and you want to be able to come back and find it later, depending on where it is, especially the public domain ones will let you add to it. And that's a big benefit to them because they can see how people are actually looking at the image and how they're evaluating it. So I found things that were from the Library of Congress that were tagged with really specific hairstyle terms because somebody was searching for 1940s hairstyles, found it, and was like, I found it, I'm going to make sure somebody else can find it. You can also create galleries. So here are examples of that. So looking at, I searched for peeling paint, and then I added a favorite onto it, and this was a metaphor I was using, so that's straightforward. And then I could find in my favorites all of the pictures of peeling paint that I really wanted to look at. Tags for this I use all the time when I'm putting things up. Chicago-Kent College of Law, it actually has spaces when I type it in with quotation marks, but when you click on it, it shows up that way. So you can see the range of things that are showing up that way. So if you're using that, by the way, Callie also has an account on Flickr with lovely legal education cartoons. So if you're looking for quick stuff to use, try that. It's much more likely that you'll actually be able to search for those weirdo legal terms that nobody else uses in their custom tags. And here's an example of one of my galleries. Yeah, brains. I don't know how many people have seen this on Twitter, but I actually had a birthday party last year that was a garden zombie tea party, so I used this as decorations. So
I was going to say there was a story there.
yeah, there's a story. I'll show you the results later. So the Flickr download options are under that little arrow there, and as you can see, sometimes you can get them in really large resolution. Don't get them too big for what you need, it just wastes space, so pick the one that makes sense. And this is where you see the Creative Commons rights. So attribution, just look for whatever their name is here. You don't have to figure out what their real name is because that's what they've provided, but they do want to get citation for it. Non-commercial is the one with the $ through it. That's probably fine for most of us in education to use. I've never had anybody complain about that. Can be modified, maybe an issue. That's not showing up here, but it is one where they don't want you to be cropping it or recoloring it or something like that. So I will sometimes just limit the Creative Commons filter to make sure that I'm not searching for those first if I know that I'm probably going to want to make a change. And share with the same license is that circular arrow, and that's not usually a problem. We're not like copywriting stuff, but if one of your faculty members wanted to put this out in a journal article or something like that, you might need to think about that. Flickr is available as a mobile thing, but it does not have search filters on there. Boo. It doesn't have gallery tools, so it's mostly like if you're marking it as a favorite, it's really more intended for individual users than for those advanced features. So here are links to that's how I also have a gallery titled Horror, Agony, Fright that I use to decorate my tea party. I do have ones that would be more likely to be useful to all of you. There's one on law and justice, one that's the targets, and one that's silhouettes. If you're talking about people in the abstract, that's a visual tip that's really helpful. Look for silhouettes, because it's much more likely that people won't look at it and be like, but why do you have a picture of that person? Or that person doesn't look like they're from this place. But if you're using a silhouette, it often allows you to do more things with the graphic design that look very modern too. So you can explore the way my brain works. So Google image search, how does it compare? You can, with the advanced options, search for things that are larger than a specific size, search for aspect ratio. You can search for colors, and so there's a lot of the same things as you dig into these advanced features. Usage rights, free to use, to share or modify. That's again the same kind of filter that you would find on Flickr, so those are available. How accurate they are is harder to judge. One of the things, let me see if I can find it. Don't know if any of these slides show it, so let me just escape and go to one of these. So let's say I have this gallery of law and justice symbols, and I want to make sure that this picture is not actually stock photography that somebody stole, because that is a factor when you're getting stuff off of social sites like this. Oops, clicked on the person instead of the page. Okay, so here's the specific thing. I can see EXIF data, which is the metadata that the camera is saving into the image. And most of us would never be able to see this if you're finding it through something like Google image search. But on Flickr, it automatically reveals it. And I've used this when I'm teaching photography because it's very helpful to compare all of these things when you're getting into the technicalities of photography. But the nice thing is when I click on this, I can check a couple of other pictures by the same person and see if he always takes it with the same kind of camera. Over time, probably not, because people's cameras change. I'm going to get rid of this stuff that says look at it by my gallery. And then I should be able to see the pictures he uploaded. See, he put several different pictures from the same area. That again is much more likely that's the same person. He didn't go and get some stock photography website and download all of them and break all of their licenses. And they're all taken by the same thing, and they actually have information about where they were taken. If you can find that level of detail, you can be pretty confident that Brent Moore took these pictures. Yes?
Wouldn't it also be helpful to search in Google Images by image?
Oh, absolutely. What I'm showing on the slide are definitely, when I was showing that, it's definitely by image. You can only get to these advanced features when you're searching by image.
Right.
Yes.
But you could search for that specific image by image.
You can. Yeah, you could do a reverse search. If you're in Chrome, you can right-click on it and say search by image. But when I'm already on Flickr, I already have the option to see all of that information.
Okay.
If I'm on Google, I might search for the image again. That actually came up recently. We have a faculty member who she found a picture by doing the Google filter and was like, this is a great picture. And I looked at it, I was like, I don't think so. I don't think that's actually Creative Commons at all. That looks like too high of a quality of image of too specific a topic, because it was a picture of a rundown house in Detroit with the beautiful downtown right next to it, just the vantage point. And I was like, that looks like something taken by a photojournalist, because it so perfectly captures the point about change in Detroit that it's really unlikely. So I did a right-click image search, and I found, because I'm a librarian and I'm good at going through stuff, where it was on Getty Images, and we sent her the link back and said, sure, you can use it as long as you pay $700. And then, because I go a little above and beyond sometimes, I also searched to see if there were similar types of images available with Creative Commons on Flickr, and I sent her the links to a couple people who would put up albums of decay in Detroit. Because it is a topic that's of interest to photographers, and you're likely to find somebody who's willing to put it up. You're just not going to find that perfect image sometimes. So it depends on how specific your needs are. again, Google image search. So this is on images with all of those filters added. So you can add those filters after running a general search. And keep in mind the tools on the main page, as to your point, are much more limited. So you have to go to image search to find these things. What if you're not needing, like a lot of my presentation has been, pictures for everything? Pictures can be so detailed that they're distracting if you're using them in the wrong context. So I like to use icons, as you've already seen. So these are sources. So the Noun project is so straightforward and great that I'm just going to recommend it. But Icon Archive is one I'll demonstrate because I think it has more of the social and search filters that I like. So going back to this slide, that has a whole bunch of different icons. How did I find it? One of the things is a lot of these icon websites are designed for people who are developers. It's a very different audience. So the terms that I end up using are things that, think about somebody making an app or making a website, and what terms would they use? It's much less likely that you'll have all that beautiful metadata that you have on Flickr where people are describing their pictures, or you're getting it from a cultural institution that has all this wonderful catalogers, detailed, like this is exactly where this came from, provenance and everything. So when I was searching for these pictures, instead of searching for sign, I searched for file, and it ended up being a PNG icon. I don't know why PNG, but whatever. Book was straightforward. It was a book. Favorite was a better way of finding website because there's not really an icon or anywhere that you can think of in an app that would have an icon for website. That's too general. But they do have an icon for favorite, so I can find that. Presentation, news, those were straightforward. Social media names, obviously. Charts. Charts answer how much. Nobody likes this chart. This is a beautiful chart. It's a beautiful chart on a website. It's a beautiful chart in print. It's a terrible chart in a presentation. Don't use charts that you can't read to tell people what to do. Also think about how much labeling it needs. And does the chart match the type of focus you have? So again, tattling on some of our faculty, we had somebody who walked into one of our faculty assistants' offices, said, I want a line chart that looks like this. And said, that's great, give me your data. There's no data.
That happened.
Yeah, that was one of those, let me explain visual literacy moments. Also, most of us have probably seen things that were the Boolean things that didn't make sense, or the pie charts where it's not out of a hole. This is related to math. There are accuracy things involved in this. If you're not confident that you know which chart will be accurate, there are tools to help you. And these are just the links really quickly. So here's an example of the chart chooser. And it's kind of hard to see here, but in the toolbar at the top it says all comparison, distribution, composition, trend, relationship, or table. And as you click on it, it gives kind of a textual, like this is how this does comparison. And then it walks you through what the data would need to look like in an Excel spreadsheet, because you might actually have a pretty high visual literacy if this is the right kind of chart for this type of thing, but still be frustrated because you don't know how to set up the chart in Excel. Which column does it go into? I know how it's supposed to look, and I know what it's supposed to communicate, but how do I make it? Microsoft Office obviously has great charts. So does Google Drive. One of the nice things I like is that I can take the same data and export a bunch of different charts, and I can put them directly into Google Drive. So these are some nice, anybody else from a law school in Chicago here? This will be, if you're from Northwestern, this won't affect you, or University of Chicago, but here's the lovely stats about applications from 2012, 2013 to 2015, 2016, which I think most people around here, if you're not from a top 10 school, have experienced that exact drop, so you understand, like, yeah, that looks like what happened. Maps. Maps are an abstraction of reality, and there are lots of different ways to do that. If you are looking for files, this is one of the things where I mentioned SVG scalable vector graphics before. That's really helpful with maps because there may be things that you want to do. These are the congressional districts in Illinois. I live in this number 4 one that is a perfectly rational way to map anything. And I was trying to find online something that showed the boundaries of my congressional district, my state representative, and my state senate, and that was a not easy task. So here are a few of the places you can go to get maps. Things from cultural institutions like the Castaneda Library to Google Maps. Obviously, you do need to check the terms of service, because if you're trying to use that on a website, you're probably fine if you're embedding it. If you are trying to publish something from Google Maps in an academic article, you cannot claim copyright on that. So keep that in mind. Wikimedia Commons is where I find most of the maps that we're on here. So, I mean, I probably don't actually have the right to use the Chicago L map. I don't think anybody's going to sue me for that. I'm going to claim fair use. Here's an example of maps that I made. I don't recommend anybody try to do this without a lot of graphic design background because I left one of these changes to another staff member and she was not happy with me. Our space has changed, obviously, over the last few years. So on the library map today, or tour today, they were talking about losing a lot of shelves and I was like, that sounds familiar. But this was an easy way of conveying information, and the fact that this is a vector graphic makes it easier for me to change specific labels on the room. So I have these as files, as Dawn knows that I make changes when she tells me to. If you can get a vector graphic, you're much more likely to be able to make changes. But these are actually PNGs, and I actually just drew shapes on top of them because I didn't have time to go and open up the graphic design tool. So on Google Drive, I could just add shapes and make them semi-transparent and add lines. It took a little bit longer than maybe it should have, but it wasn't that hard. Okay, oops, going too fast. Here we go. For very technical people, here's a tool. It's wonderful. I haven't even tried to use it because it's very technical. But if you did need to do something with complex big data and maps, this is probably the tool that would be better than Google Maps. Timelines. Timelines are great for processes. They're also good for telling a story. So here we have to-dos. They're not happy with each other. It escalates. It really escalates. And now we have a full story. They're in the court. We don't know what happens next, but it's legal. So if you're making a timeline, this is really easy to do this. So if I escape out of here, you'll see that basically I just made this image and copied the slide 4 times. So if you're doing something like that you want to be animated, you want to tell a story with your own timing, start with the full version and work backwards. Don't ever start doing it manually. It's going to be a not happy process because you'll end up having to make changes and then go back and try to align everything. Definitely not worth it. Timelines can also be fun things like Google Ngram. I keep meaning to go in here and update this to also include vampires, but over time, this shows the prevalence of, so again, this is one of those things where you want to know the data. So the data set for Google Ngram is all of the things in Google Books that they have scanned, that they've done textual analysis of in this immense data set to see the popularity of any word over time. So I typed in zombies, mummies, Frankenstein. So you could have a debate with me about whether I should have used the plural or the singular for any of those things. But whether that would have had an effect, we could type all of those things in over and over and see which ones are popular. That's kind of a fun way to do timeline. There's a lot of other tools out there. Some of these, this is one of my old slides, so I would need to double check this. I think some of these free tools come and go, and unfortunately I'm not sure if Dippity is still working. But a lot of times you don't have to go super technical for something like this. Think about the simplest possible way to convey information and start there. Don't make more work for yourself than you need to, especially online tools that come and go. If it's something you can download, great. If it's something that has to live there, you're taking a risk when you put a lot of work into it. Same thing for flowcharts. Flowcharts answer the question how. It could be a loose connection, it could be hierarchical, it could be steps. Just like with charts, keep in mind it may be great online, it may be great in print, it may not be great in a presentation unless it's something that's really simple to read. And flowcharts are one of those things that do require a certain amount of visual literacy for people to understand how they work. So they might seem really intuitive if they're your favorite thing, but test them out with somebody else to make sure it's something they can read and understand what you're trying to get across. It's something that's much more popular, I think, in IT with the kinds of logic that people are trained in than in the general populace. There are, if you're just getting into them, I really recommend PowerPoint as the best possible option because you start off with just a simple bullet point list and you say convert to SmartArt and you can try all of these things and just switch between them until you're like, oh, yeah, that illustrates exactly what I'm trying to do. There's also tools out there that help you do some of these more technical ones, or if for some reason you needed to do office layouts. So, copyright. I'm going to go fast about this because I think I've probably took the time talking a lot, yes. And I want to leave time for questions. I start off with, number one, in case anybody didn't know, as soon as you take a picture, you have copyright. You do not have to register copyright. If you register copyright, it's a lot easier to sue people, but technically you have copyright. But on the other hand, if I take a picture because I'm doing event photography for work, I don't own that copyright anymore because I was being paid to do it. So if I wanted to release copyright, I probably could just because I'm on the team that gives permission. But on the other hand, you technically should have to ask my employer. It just happens that I'd be the person you ask at my employer. When did they create it will affect copyright as well, obviously, in terms of dates. Trademark is totally different than copyright. If you're ever putting logos for a company on there, think carefully, because they're required to defend their usage if they see somebody using it wrong.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What happens if you are hired to take pictures of a wedding, but you don't want the bride and groom to take your images? How does that
Good
work?
luck. Honestly, when you get into things like that, social media has changed a lot of things about expectations. That doesn't mean it's legally changed anything.
Okay.
But in terms of that, it's really hard to protect images firmly online because it's just so easy to copy things. I am recommending best practices. I'm not telling you that it is impossible to do something illegal because that is not true. Privacy rights. One of the things also, if you asked me for a picture that I took at an event at work, I would not be able to give you permission to use it anywhere if it was a picture of somebody else.
Okay.
Because I go every single time when I'm doing event photography with a sheet of paper and walk up to the speaker and say, hey, would you be willing to sign an image release? And that image release has very specific language, and it does not include me using it in a portfolio, and it does not include me giving it to somebody else to use for whatever illustration they want to use. It's for the school and for its purposes. So it doesn't mean it's impossible to track somebody down and ask for permission, but you should, technically. So I like to start with trustworthy sources, as I already mentioned, ones that I can evaluate how likely this is to be good. I already mentioned if you can see metadata, technical metadata, that's a good way of checking. Identify permissions. If you can see the name and give the link, it's better. And try to keep track of that information. There are cases where people have taken pictures, put it up on something like Flickr, said that it's available for people to use with Creative Commons, and then they change the permissions. So if you're really paranoid about this kind of thing, you can keep track of it. I will just save the file name with a person's name, and if I'm putting it into something else, like a website, I will put the link back to it, and I will note which day I downloaded it. And that just gives me some kind of record of the provenance of the image, so if anybody came to it. This is also part of why I don't really recommend trying to find cheap stock photography, because if somebody's taking photos for stock photography to sell, if they end up selling it to Getty, how many people have heard of Getty's like harassment letters that they send out? Insane. They have lawyers that just do this all day long, looking for people who are using stock photography the wrong way and telling them they have to pay $5,000 or they're going to get sued. It's not fun. So don't set yourself up for that. I prefer to have information from the person. If I'm really paranoid about something on Flickr, I will contact the person because I have an account and I can send them a message. I have people contact me all the time because I put my pictures up with Creative Commons, people who aren't sure. And I've had an educator, I took pictures, because I have a food blog, of a whole bunch of dried seafood stuff. Seaweed, shrimp, fish. It was for Korean food. And it was an educator in Spain who was doing a book on the way seafood is used in cuisines around the world. And he said, it's an educational use, but it's going to be published. Is that a problem? I said, that's fine. I'm just curious how you're using it. And he has now a record saying, it's fine for me to use this. It's not a problem. And he didn't have to pay for stock photography for this really specific topic of edible seaweed.
Do you have an example of someone who used your work without your permission?
Yeah, actually. Real Simple Magazine used one of my pictures on their blog, and I contacted them in the comments and was just like, FYI, you're not using a Creative Commons license correctly, because even if you're not getting paid for writing articles for Real Simple, this is a for-profit magazine, and you should actually ask me. And I have had for-profit things. A German advertising agency was doing a website on why Germans should come visit Chicago around Christmas, and they found one of my pictures and contacted me. Didn't want to use Creative Commons, so they paid me $200. I worked out an arrangement with them.
Huh.
So I take a lot of pictures, and I've had that happen. Yeah.
So, and I probably should know the answer to this, but I don't.
Yep.
Fair use. If you're using, like if you're embedding an image within your classroom? Oh, all right. Or maybe you're already going to talk about it, so never mind then.
No, that's fine. If you're not publishing it online, you're probably not going to get in a whole lot of trouble about it. But fair use, if you are using the entire image, that is where the amount and substantiality of the portion taken is different for images than it is for other things, if that makes sense.
So, no, I get that part. But even if you're using it, I guess I always thought part of it was, even if you're using it within, you're embedding it, but you're embedding it in like an online classroom. Does that make a difference versus you're using it on your school's website for sort of
It's less
promotion?
visible, so you're probably not going to get a takedown letter because nobody will be able to find out that you did it.
Okay, but legally it doesn't matter. That standard, that doesn't matter.
It would probably make it a lot easier for you to argue that it's for the purpose and character of your uses for education,
Right.
because it is in a private education thing. So you could make the argument. I mean, fair use. We're in a legal education context. You guys know this is not something that I can give you a hard and fast rule about. You just have to take the factors into account.
Ends.
But I just wanted to note that the amount and substantiality thing is the thing that's different about visuals. Because a lot of times people are just like, oh, it's fair use. And you're like, no, people have made arguments about that that's different. So that's why I like to start with public domain, because I don't have to worry about any of that. So federal government images do have slight limitations. Like I said, you can't claim that they're sponsoring a product, and you have to be careful about the use of any of their logos for their agencies. Out of copyright, obviously, public domain, that's great, and author declares public domain. If you need something that is definitely not an old picture, you need something that's current, that looks hip, that you need really good quality, actually unsplash.com is great. I don't know how many people are using that. That's, again, one of those, people are not necessarily serving their best interest kind of things. Why are you releasing these beautiful pictures for free? But thanks. I will use them. USA.gov will also get you to government images, sometimes ones that aren't on Flickr. So we've had things where we have an Institute for Science, Law, and Technology or something like that that wants to use pictures and ends up that NASA has beautiful images. If you just like pictures, go to nasa.gov and check out their image archive. Oh, so lovely. American Memory Project is the official Library of Congress, but a lot of them are on Flickr Commons. Again, I like to start with Flickr because it kind of puts all of these things in one box. So just in terms of my amount of time spent, it's so fast. Creative Commons, I already mentioned this a bit, but obviously make sure you're following the license. Hopefully I have been a good example in these slides. Sometimes I put things in really quickly with Google Drive and then I have to go back and figure out where did I do it. The other thing is, if you're not sure, this is a lovely website, the Public Domain Sherpa updates regularly, so if you're trying to figure that out. And there are probably more tools out there for finding things in the public domain. Wikimedia Commons is also one that lets you see the information about images. So if I go to Wikimedia Commons and I search for Arizona, I can find all kinds of things like the state seal or the state flag. If I see any pictures like this, I can go into more details and see if it has where it came from. So this is making me think, did they actually release this into the public domain? Because just because somebody found it and put it on Wikimedia Commons does not mean that it's actually true, but they do usually show where they got it from. So this is somebody's individual photography portfolio, and that's a very nice photo that I happen to know because I've been there. It takes time and money to get to, and most people are not releasing that quality of image into the public domain. So just because somebody found it online and put it up on here doesn't mean that it was the photographer. So if I'm looking at this and it says, you know what, actually it's the person, maybe he did. But I'm going to want to look at the contextual information. It takes me longer to do that than it does on some of the other websites. So again, my favorite is Flickr just because it puts all the things in a really nicely designed, quick to go through option. So I think that's where I leave off. So questions? We've got a couple minutes. I did a little Q&A here, but I'm happy to stick around if anybody wants a demo or anything else like that. But it's almost 5 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you if you don't want to be here. I know it's the end of the day.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And it's something that our library is dealing with. I'm not a librarian, so forgive me, library people, when I use the right word. But we've been digitizing a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff in our archives and things. And because there are dead people that we have photos of that might be kind of cool to use. I know the questions keep coming up about we don't have any kind of releases or a language research.
Somebody who's gone.
So, just out of curiosity, and I don't know that our library has decided exactly how they're going to handle that, but it's a lot of discussion.
I took a digital photography or digital libraries class a while back. And I know this is the sort of thing that I read about, but honestly, it was like 2008,
Yeah.
and it's been almost 10 years, and I don't remember what the best practices are. I would recommend looking into the archival community specifically for what they do with that. I know that that's how archives handle that. Let me see if I can search for it on here. Remember what the title of it was.